Well, I think what we're seeing in local communities is, and this is, communities in different places around the United States, which, obviously they're different. They're in different places. They have different geographies. They have different demographics, different industries, so forth and so on. But what they have in common is very restricted ability to actually protect themselves. And what I mean by that is protect their air.
Our next speaker is
community.
Many before me have said,
We do not want lead poisoning in this community.
Their drinking water, the nature within the municipality.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Only in San Jose, a podcast about demystifying and democratizing the process of civic participation only in San Jose. My name is Ellina Yin, and I will be your host. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to all things civic and local government. So, in celebration of Earth Day today, and also every day is Earth Day, I wanted to share a previously unreleased episode from our archives. This was recorded back in March of 2022, where I speak with Mari Margil. She is the executive director of the Center for Democratic and Environmental Rights. She works with civil society, governments, as well as tribal nations and indigenous communities in the U.S., Ecuador, the Philippines, Nepal, and elsewhere to advance rights of nature frameworks. She has consulted with Ecuador's Constituent Assembly, helping to draft the world's first rights of nature constitutional provisions in 2008. Margil received her master's degree from Harvard University's JFK School of Government and is the co-author of The Bottom Line, or Public Health. Another one, Exploring Wild Law, The Philosophy of Earth Jurisprudence, and Bearing Witness, The Human Rights Case Against Fracking and Climate Change, among various other publications, which I have listed in the show notes if you want to check out. Now for some context. So back in March 2022, the Charter Review Commission had just finished working on reviewing our city constitution, the city charter, and would later come to approve unanimously a few recommendations that would become a ballot measure for that year's gubernatorial election, and that would be known later as Measure I. This would then go on to be approved by voters in November. And my conversation with Mari was held at that time when I was searching for examples outside of San Jose on how we could begin to address climate solutions on a local level. Unfortunately, at that time, the climate recommendations that were being studied did not make it into the charter changes or the ballot, but that is the nature of this work sometimes. Nothing is done in one fell swoop, but persistently and consistently over time, things can change. For example, in the introductory clip, I featured a remix of some public comments during a Santa Clara County Board of Supervisors meeting on the closure of the Reed Hillview Airport in East San Jose. Now, this has been a community-led issue for decades, but at that time, what was new was that the Santa Clara County Board of Supervisors commissioned a lead study in 2020 using 17,000 blood samples collected between 2011 and 2020 from children living near the airport. The study found elevated lead levels in children's blood during periods of high traffic at the airport, on par with the lead levels in children during the Flint, Michigan water crisis. This fight is now moving beyond the county to the state level, and you can read more about it in our show notes. I worked with an artist by the name of Mias to capture those public comments, and I found it really aptly resonant with a conversation that I had with Mari on the people's ability to protect their basic rights to clean air and water. And it's an uphill battle, to say the least. Now, for me personally, I've always been an environmental activist. I was writing angry poetry, sonnets about rivers and waterways since I was 16. I would actually also go on to work in water and wastewater treatment for 5.5 years before switching to the nonprofit world in civics. I am also so lucky to have so many children in my life. From toddlers to teenagers, I think about their future a lot. And everything I do, a part of me is always focused on them and their futures. So this Earth Day, I wanted to highlight that struggle, both around the world and right here at home. And I hope this conversation can keep us hopeful and determined to continue to fight for climate solutions for present and future generations. Thank you. Okay, why don't we can start, and if you can introduce yourself, your pronouns, and some hobbies and passions that you have that can help that's helped you grounded yourself in this work during this pandemic and hard times.
Well, Ellina, thank you so much for inviting us to participate in this. I'm very happy to join you and be here today. My name is Mari Margil, pronouns she, her, and I'm with the Center for Democratic and Environmental Rights. We are based in Washington State and do work not only within the United States and with tribal nations, but also globally. And during the pandemic, well, I have spent a lot of time trying to be outdoors as much as possible. And I tend to do that anyway, but particularly during the pandemic, I was probably more mindful about it than I would be otherwise. So that has been something that's helped kind of keep me grounded, rejuvenated, inspired, hopeful during the pandemic in particular. And I have to admit that I've been really pleasantly surprised that we see that kind of discussion taking place over the last 2 years, how much people are, and maybe you feel this way too, how people are surprised, I guess is the word, or happy to find that being outdoors is something that maybe they didn't prioritize before and now are, and how much it comes to mean for them, not just in terms of their just they enjoy it, but also for their mental and emotional and physical well-being. I think that's actually been, to me, one of the surprisingly silver linings of the pandemic, is that I think people are definitely feeling more connected with nature. And I think that is a very good thing just in general, but very important in particular today as we face so many environmental challenges, that people feel that connection. And I think that connection motivates people to action.
Yes, definitely felt the same way. That was kind of one of my modes of release, was after the workday, just to kind of go out and take a walk, and having a lot more time and initiative to just go outside and take a break. Whereas if you were in the office, that initiative and inspiration is a little bit more tempered. And I think what I realized when I realized it was so important was actually in August of 2020. So California had, one of the worst fire years that year. And I don't know if you remember seeing the reports. We had like orange sky. It looked very apocalyptic. And
Unfortunately, sorry to interrupt, but
no, go ahead.
unfortunately I do, because here in Washington State, it was a terrible fire year as well.
Mhm.
I don't mean to compare
Yeah.
how bad it was, but yes, I absolutely appreciate what you're saying.
Yeah, it was just that month of August. It was like exactly a month where you couldn't go outside and walk, and so you were stuck literally in your house, for an entire month. And that was probably the hardest part of the pandemic, was being trapped and separated from nature, but also seeing how much our environment was suffering during that time.
Yes, I have to say I quite agree with you. For us, it was more into September of that year,
Hmm.
and it uh, almost to a person, every person I've talked to about that time period when going outside was dangerous,
Hmm.
felt the most oppressive and most difficult of the pandemic, because you didn't have the ability to go outside. And if you did, you were wearing a mask. not because of the pandemic, but because of the smoke. And that was just, it was really, really difficult and stressful. And I know that for a lot of people who hadn't perhaps been so concerned about the climate, or the connection with wildfires, that it was an eye-opening moment for them. So I guess a silver lining in that, but not one we would have to otherwise have, obviously.
Yeah, yeah. Families with children. I mean, I don't have any children, so it was a little bit, it's quiet in my house, but still, I couldn't imagine.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, before we get started, would you be able to share, like, a defining moment in your story of how you got to where you are today and why you chose, to do the work that you do?
Well, I guess for me, I'm not sure I have one defining moment. It's probably more like multiple.
The
And those
arc, yeah.
are, as somebody who's worked in government and worked as an activist and sort of seen, as they say, how the sausage gets made in terms of lawmaking and policy making and politics and working for candidates and on issues, you sort of along the way have these moments where you realize, for me anyway, it felt too often that we were fighting or struggling or organizing to try to stop something bad from happening instead of trying to advocate for something good to happen. And that always felt like we were just trying to put out the next fire or trying to lessen the harm or damage that was going to occur. It never, well, for me, I rarely, I should say, felt that we were making actual positive impact moving forward. And that's that's dissatisfying, is a way to say it. It's dissatisfying, but also just really begins to weigh on you. And for me, that sort of meant that I was kind of always trying to figure out, how do I feel like I can actually move forward in a positive way instead of constantly fighting fires. And ultimately, the work that I focus the most on now is really changing how we govern ourselves toward the natural world, how we change how nature itself is treated under law and governance, work within recognizing rights of the natural world. And that to me has been very much about advancing not only a legal and governing shift, but also a cultural shift that I think is really, really necessary for us as human beings to change how we live on the planet. And so for me, that's been inspiring and important. And it's sort of taken me a journey to get here, but I'm here.
We're glad that you're here. Yeah, I was just speaking with my partner this morning about being, when we were 17, like giving that college, college catalog, and you just pick your major, like you're picking the rest of your life.
Yeah.
And it's a story that we're told through the movies and all the stories that we've read, but not a lot is talked about how long it takes sometimes to come into your purpose or your passion, and how that's okay as well.
No, that is true. It feels like a defining moment. And that is one of the things I think that, I don't know, I guess as we get older, we come to understand that nothing ever stays the same. Change is
Yes.
constant. And so, it's hard to sometimes internalize that for ourselves when we're faced with what we think is a very big decision. But I think it is important to remind ourselves that change, not only is change constant in our own personal lives, but that change is possible.
Yeah.
So not only for our personally or professionally, but in the world. And that I think is really important for us to hold too, that we can make change, positive change, whether it's for ourselves or the world in general. And if we didn't know that, we probably wouldn't even be having this conversation, actually.
Absolutely. I never thought I would be having a conversation about the Constitution at some point in my life.
There you go.
To 17-year-old Ellina. So yeah, on that topic, so the Center for Democratic Environmental Rights, you have a project called the New Constitution Project, and so can you tell us a little bit about that?
That is born out of just years and years and years of um, understanding and learning and studying and working within the confines of our existing constitutional structure and understanding the history of it, how it came to be, that we have the Constitution that we do. And it's about envisioning what kind of changes we need for the world that we live in today versus the world that we had 250 years ago. And the history of the US Constitution is very much a history of racism, very much a history of slavery, very much a history of oppression of women, indigenous peoples, other peoples, and a history of oppression of the natural world. And coming to grips with that, understanding that, and in some ways breaking the mythology that we tend to have in the United States about the Constitution, is something that we've been grappling with for years and years, and have come to a place where we feel that it's very difficult to change the Constitution for all the reasons you would want it to be difficult to change the Constitution, because you want it to stand the test of time. But at the same time, it hasn't kept up with the times. And so the new Constitution project is really intended to be, in the very best way, a democratic process in which anybody can provide their vision to what a new Constitution would look like for the United States, provide their input and gathering of that input and kind of working through it to see what shape that can look in. And part of the focus of it is, how do we make a government that is more democratic, number one, but number two, how do we make a form of a governmental framework, structure, system, that is able to make us live sustainably, truly in harmony with nature, in a way that we are absolutely not doing right now. So putting the, whether it be, you call it the rights of nature or the rights of the natural environment, ensuring that the ability of nature to exist and to thrive is protected within our most important fundamental governing document, i.e. the Constitution, is really critical. Right now, we are living so beyond the capacity of the natural world, living so in such an unsustainable way. And that change that we need is absolutely essential. And it's not going to happen without really building it into the building blocks of our own nation, i.e. our basic governing documents, which the Constitution represents.
I am in researching, I've been learning from some of your videos actually about, Dillon's law and the common commercial commerce laws. And so I'm interested to see, in your work with other cities, what have you seen town and cities do with their city charter? I know that there's like certain barriers to how much they can enact, but part of the new Constitution project is kind of building that grassroots level to put pressure on state and federal legislation. And so what have you seen happening in local communities?
Well, I think what we're seeing in local communities is, and this is, communities in different places around the United States, which, obviously they're different. They're in different places. They have different geographies. They have different demographics, different industries, so forth and so on. But what they have in common is very restricted ability to actually protect themselves. And what I mean by that is protect their air, their drinking water, the nature within the municipality, protect the environment. Communities in the United States have seen power stripped away from them from pre-colonial times when, for example, in what is now New England, you had colonial communities, towns that establish, what we call town meeting, the ability of people within the community to not only participate, but be authorized. Essentially, they self-authorize themselves to make the key critical decisions for their communities. And people came together within these town meetings and made decisions together. We are far, far from that in terms of what communities can decide on today. state and the federal government has over time restricted and limited what municipalities, what communities can do, what they can make decisions about. So, for instance, you have, oil and gas laws, you have laws related to GMOs, you have laws related to factory farming, you have laws related to all sorts of industrial activities, and including just commercial development of mini malls. All of these kinds of industrial types of activities or operations, permitting of those, authorizing of those happens at the state level or at the federal level. There is some local permitting involved, but communities are largely prevented from deciding whether or not these kinds of industrial activities, which bring known harm to the natural world, communities are very restricted in whether or not they have the ability to decide when things can actually happen in their communities, to say yes or no, to say yes or no to fracking, yes or no to a factory farm, yes or no to GMO seeds. And so communities have grown increasingly restricted in the kinds of decisions that they can make. And we're seeing communities begin to push back against that. That they're the ones who should be able to make decisions about whether or not they're breathing fumes, whether or not GMO seeds can be planted within their community, whether or not there's going to be a factory farm. Communities are pushing back to say that we're the ones who should be making the decisions because we're the ones that bear the brunt of the harm that comes if that decision is made.
So speaking for our cities in general, what have you seen, or what do you think is one of the most powerful things that we could add to our city charter, that could help set us up for success as this new movement? And I would say new movement because I think ever since the 2020 Black Lives Matter protests and the pandemic and having all of these public meetings now be exclusively online, I've just seen in my own city so many people are calling in and so many people are participating, like looking at a city budget and what does that do and where can I have a say? And so there's kind of like this hunger to participate, but at the same time, we're operating in a system that wasn't really designed. For example, we're a city of 1 million people, and so there's like 400,000 adults maybe, and if all 400 participated, the system would break in terms of being overwhelmed with community input. And so long-winded, but yeah, if you have seen anything that has been kind of a topic of discussion for city charters that has been successful or is kind of a new best practice.
Well, one of the things, here's an example, which goes a bit back to your last question as well, which is that some communities have begun to build in certain rights. So rights related to particularly the environment. So right of the people to a healthy environment and the right of the environment itself to be healthy, or the right of a particular ecosystem, such as a river or waterways. Rights that strengthen protections at the local level for nature, strengthen them beyond the level set at the state or the federal level. So essentially, communities saying we need to put in a stronger level of protection for this river than is allowed at the state or the federal level. So going above and beyond. Now, that's some of the work that we are involved in. One of the places that's happened most recently in 2020 was in Orange County, Florida, where they also went through a charter review commission process in which they reviewed the charter. Commission was put together over the course of more than a year. Their charter review commission reviewed the charter, see where changes were needed, and obviously from their perspective, citizens were given the ability to provide input and recommendations and proposals for change. And that's one of the places that we worked with people on the ground to say, what kind of change do you think is needed? And one of those changes that was proposed to the Charter Review Commission was recognizing the rights of waterways within the county charter. That was proposed, it was reviewed, there were hearings held, testimony given about this proposal, working on the provisions and what that would look like on the paper. And ultimately, the Charter Review Commission in Orange County agreed through their process that, yes, this is important enough to amend the charter with. We're going to, through their process, put it on the ballot for a vote of the people of that county, which is the process they need to follow to make these changes. Ultimately, November 2020, the people of Orange County, Florida, voted on this proposal to recognize rights of waterways within their county charter. And it was adopted with 89% of the vote.
Wow.
Yeah, which is really extraordinary because, Orange County, Florida, Central Florida, it's not a liberal bastion. It's, red voters, blue voters, people in between. And so it was people from, quote unquote, both sides of the aisle coming together to say, we need to recognize rights of waterways, meaning we need to recognize and put into place protections for the waterways in our county that are stronger than what the state or the federal government have done or are willing to do. Because what the state and the federal government are doing isn't enough to protect these waterways. So the community quite literally took the initiative to make stronger changes. And we're seeing the interest in that, not only in charter counties or charter cities, but also in other kinds of communities, towns, villages, others that see the need to put in place stronger protections with the environment, including the human right to environment, than what's happening at higher levels of government. And I think that's really quite important, not only to protect nature, of course, but also to say, you're not doing your job. That's essentially what that is people saying to their state and federal, elected officials and governors, you're not doing your job. You're not protecting these waterways or nature to the degree they need to be protected. And so we're going to do it. And hopefully, through more organizing and grassroots campaigning and so on, that builds enough pressure, builds enough strength to drive those changes upward at the state level to the federal level.
Okay. Wow, that is so impressive and inspiring. We have one river here, and it's very polluted. It's we're not really able to access or interact with the river that much here.
And it goes without saying, it absolutely should not be that way. Absolutely should not be that way. And you could consider, through the process, whether through the Charter Review Commission, you have the initiative process there. How do you want to envision, explore, and advance change so that that river begins to get cleaned up? That's, it's easy for me to say that. It's not I don't mean to suggest that it's an easy thing to do, but it is one of the things that people are doing in their communities because they see the failure at the state and federal level to do this.
Yeah, I remember when I went to Austin for the first time and was just kayaking and hanging out at freshwater springs, and I was just amazed. And like, San Jose could be like this if only.
Right. And I understand that. I absolutely do. And we shouldn't have to be thinking in that way. If only. It's sort of, it's heart-wrenching to have to think that way. It's, we the people, we in our communities have the ability to advance initiatives, to put pressure on our elected officials, to take steps to change what's happening with your river right now. And that kind of organizing is challenging, it's difficult, it's time consuming. But with the folks and the groups and the communities that we work with, they see it as absolutely, something that they are spending so much of their time seeking to do because they don't see any other choice, frankly, for change to be made without them taking those steps. And sometimes that happens through Charter Review Commission. Sometimes that happens through people putting an initiative together and proposing it and collecting signatures and putting it on the ballot. There's different ways, even when our own elected officials are unwilling to take these steps, there are some, what we call direct democracy pathways that people can develop and propose and advance and pass laws directly through the will of the voter.
Okay, so speaking, of these direct democracy pathways, what are your thoughts on the importance of boards and commissions within the democratic process?
Well, I mean, I think they're important. It's a way for people to engage. It's a way for community members to serve. But, you very often they're advisory. And you'd like to see them have more capacity to be able to take what the work that they're doing, the vision that they develop for their community with community input, and having a pathway for them to actually make that become um, substantive. And what I mean by that is like binding. And so maybe there are ways that boards or commissions can be empowered to put a question directly to voters, for instance. We have very centralized governments right now, and it's very difficult to put things before voters, to get things through a city council, for instance, or a county commission. Maybe we need to find ways to open that direct democracy portal for boards and commissions to be able to put their important work forward as a way for people to consider and actually vote on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't think, from what I've witnessed in city council here and what was discussed in the Charter Review Commission, like for the first time, I was like really engaged with just how we were addressing and talking about climate and how we were talking about different ideas on indigenous wisdom and land acknowledgements. And what I was really surprised was, for me personally, American government really stopped at the state level. And I never really learned about the mayor or mayor council or what a city manager or really anything that impacted me directly in my lived experience of the law. And so it's been a very kind of just going to the internet and doing my own research and figuring out how to best participate. And so from your years of experience, what are your thoughts on like the state of civic participation in the United States, and where do you think we could head into the future if we were more optimistic and heading towards a better future? How can we begin to think about community engagement and this process of lawmaking?
Well, I do think it's difficult for people who haven't been engaged to take that step forward. And I think what you said earlier about the pandemic, putting things online, meetings by Zoom, city council meetings that we can see, call into, that sort of thing, that that may have actually opened that up for a lot more people to engage, which I think is very positive. But I also think it can get really stifling. It can be really hard to access that, to engage in it, and to feel like your engagement is meaningful. That is, that you're actually able to not only meaningfully engage and communicate your position, perhaps to your elected officials, but that you can actually see change coming from that. I think that we find that can be really frustrating and cause people to engage and then walk away or be exhausted by that process. Which is why I think one of the reasons that direct democracy is really important. That is the ability to, use the citizen initiative or the charter amendment process to make changes, but other ways too, that people can truly be the instruments of change. So I think it can be really disappointing when, for instance, you have like a climate commission set up, that when you find out that, well, they could take testimony, they could do reports and so on, but for instance, like a city council is not obligated to do anything with that. So all this time and work that we see, a climate commission, for instance, at the local level, it can all come for naught very quickly when it gets to the elected officials. So there's got to be ways that we can change that so that our engagement is more meaningful, that we can actually see change coming from it. I think that's really important, because why would somebody get involved in something in which there's no outcome for them apart from just being able to say what's important to them and then walk away, and then nothing comes from it. So I think we've got to open up those democratic portals so that more people can not only engage and voice their concerns or opinions, what have you, but also to be able to help with the change that's getting made. And I think that's where that brick wall goes up, when people realize that right now it seems that a lot of the time we engage, whether at the local level or the state and federal level, and the door gets slammed shut at us once we say what we have to say.
Yeah. Yeah. I when I first started looking into boards and commissions, I actually studied the Planning Commission. And I read a book by Scott Klein, like The Real Estate State. And I was really impressed and also a little bit horrified at how entrenched real estate developers were within the Planning Commission and how much they were able to shape the cities and towns that they were involved in. And so I was under the same notion that, okay, if this commission's powerful, all of them are powerful, but that of course is not true. And I'm trying to figure out all of those secret loopholes or just ordinances and things that I don't know. But I definitely agree with you that we need to add some more power towards boards and commissions, because I think people are hungry to be a part of it and to make change, but they want it to be meaningful and not just into some internet void Zoom verse that will never be heard of again.
Yeah. I think one of the things that pandemic has revealed, not only in my own city, but in many places around the country, for instance, that we have public health boards that oversee our public health departments, often at the county level. And it became, because of the pandemic and the need for public health rules and enforcement of those rules to protect people, it became really clear that many of them, I shouldn't say all, but many are not, that those public health commissions aren't made up of public health practitioners, doctors, nurses, other people in the public health world, people who are truly experts in public health, but instead are made up by politicians, elected officials, who don't have necessarily a public health background. And that's one of those sort of places, the pandemic revealed that politics has elected people have so much control over so much, and we just don't tend to see it in our day to day. But when a pandemic hits, we start to see those things. Something like really significant has to happen for us to really see revealed how a lot of these, not only local, certainly, but certainly local, things occur, and how much control is held by so few, and who they are. So I think that one of the things that we as people living within a place, municipality, a state, a government, federal government, we ourselves do have an obligation to understand how this stuff works, how government works, who's in control, who's sitting on these commissions that are actually able to make decisions, who's steering, who's pulling the levers, what kind of role does campaign money play, et cetera. Because without knowing that, we'll never be able to change it. And so we ourselves have an obligation. It's not easy to do. That's part of the difficulty, is it's not easy to see this stuff a lot of the time. And because without knowing this stuff, which so many of us just don't know, and we don't even necessarily know to go and look for it, the people who are, quote unquote, in charge are able to do their own bidding because there's nobody there to stop them. So just to say what you're doing, your own sort of self-education, I think is really, to be congratulated. It's not easy to do. It's not necessarily the most exciting and sexy stuff in the world, but it's important. It is important. And it's sort of amazing what you learn along the way about who's making decisions for us, for our community, for how we live, and seeing, okay, that doesn't seem right. We need to start making some changes. So I applaud you. I really do, because it's, it can be dry. But I think it's really, people don't do difficult things generally because it's fun. They do it, in terms of like making social change. They don't do it because it's fun or something that they really, necessarily want to do. It's because they feel a drive and a necessity to do it. And I applaud you for taking those steps because it's not easy, it's not necessarily fun, it's time consuming, and it can be difficult.
Yes, it's very difficult. I'm always trying to kind of interpret and translate some of the drier concepts into analogies, and I've taught a few youth classes, and it's fun to teach it in that context, but it is very difficult to keep people engaged because I think in society where we have like instant gratification and we want to see the results. And so when we say like we're going to change this, but it's going to be 10 years and you kind of start to lose people a little bit. But hopefully I feel optimistic that we're heading towards a better direction with civic participation.
Good. I'm going to take inspiration from that.
Yeah. So, I wanted to maybe zoom back a little bit and talk about the U.S. Constitution. And from what I know of it in the, the late 1700s, when all of the delegates came together to talk about the government of the United States and what it should have. At that time, I guess there was no contemporary democracies in Europe from which they could draw inspiration. And so the most democratic forms of government that they knew of were Native American nations. And so they had a significant influence in the U.S. Constitution. And you have done work with tribal nations and indigenous communities in Australia. So could you speak to, their form of governance or at least what you know about their decision-making structures and community engagement?
Well, tribal nations within the United States have, of course, been decimated by colonialism, white settlement, genocide, and they have and continue to suffer the long, long consequences of that. And one of the things that we often don't know is their forms of government today largely have been forced upon them by the federal government.
Mm-hmm.
Meaning that when you take a look at a tribal constitution, and this isn't the case for every tribal nation, but many, many, many of them have tribal constitutions. And if you look at them and you look at, read more than one, you often see that they are written very similarly. And the question becomes why? And the answer is the federal government forced them upon them to create these written constitutions that were not in keeping with their culture, their own laws, their own forms of governance. They were really the white man's way being forced upon them. And so we have, in our work in partnership with tribal nations, came to really understand that and have found that a lot of tribes are seeking to change, amend, reshape, whatever language you want to use, to change those tribal constitutions to really begin to reflect who they are as a culture, who they are as a people, their relationship with their traditional lands, to reflect their own language. One of the places that we've seen an intersection there is with the rights of nature. That is, that the rights of nature for many people, but particularly we've found in our work with Indigenous peoples, reflects their relationship with nature, and that the rights of nature, recognizing that nature has rights, that nature has inherent worth, that we need to respect that nature has that and not have our own human activities interfere with the ability of nature to be healthy and robust and resilient. That has become something of interest to some tribal members, tribal officials, tribal nations who've begun to move this concept of rights of nature into their own tribal laws and governance as a reflection of their own relationship with Mother Earth. And that to me has been really quite inspiring and heartening to see that and to understand what that means for them, and how they're shaping that. And so that's some of the work that we've done. One example I'll share with you is with the White Earth Band of Chippewa in Minnesota, part of the larger Chippewa Nation. The White Earth, we worked with tribal members to develop a tribal law that recognizes monomen, or what is wild rice, that they have traditionally and still depend upon as a staple food that has not only nutritional value for them as something that they eat, but also has great cultural and historical importance for them. We worked with them to develop a law to recognize rights of the monomen, or the wild rice, to protect it as it faces harm from everything. The wild rice grows in fresh water, everything from development and water quality issues, as well as climate change, which is warming waters, and things like the building of tar sands oil pipeline, like the Enbridge Line 3 line that's going through and taking water that the wild rice needs. So we work with recognize within their laws rights of the wild rice. And last August 2021, the rice itself, along with members, brought the first case ever brought in a tribal court to enforce the rights of the wild rice, and against this taking of water for the building of Line 3, the tar sands oil pipeline. And so we're seeing this develop within tribal law, this recognition of the rights of the natural world, and tribal nations beginning to enforce those rights so that they can enforce and defend those rights when they face threats upon those rights, on the ability of the rice, in this case, to be healthy and thriving and robust and resilient as a species.
Wow, that's amazing. Well, we're wrapping up towards the end now, and one of the last few questions I had was, in my study of the Constitution, I was able to notice definitely the many complex systems of checks and balances and decision making, but it was mainly a structure for the elected legislative body. But when it comes to community interaction, we have the people have the right to instruct their representatives, petition government for redress of grievances, and assemble freely to consult for the common good. But there isn't much more beyond that with, I guess, legislators and the community, and how they build relationships or stay accountable to each other. I only know of boards and commissions as the one place where you don't have to run for office to join. You can apply and be appointed. But where do you think this could move towards in the future, or have you seen anything in the future that kind of creates more linkage between legislative representatives and accountability, and how they engage with their constituents beyond voting?
Beyond voting, yeah. I mean, there's got to be, we have ways to recall elected officials, for instance, but it's difficult to do that. There isn't a lot of obligation. We've seen this idea that we have the right to petition government for grievance or engage with our representatives. The primary way that so many elected bodies at the local level get away with this is having a 1 minute, 2 minute, 3 minute, public moment during their weekly meetings in which people can stand up and say whatever they want. Again, not very satisfying, not very meaningful or substantive, unless you fill the room with 300 people who want to say, and deliver the same message, which is difficult to do. It's difficult to organize people like that. It doesn't feel like we can have real substantive impact. And so, that we as people need to put in the time and organize ourselves to do that. And one of the things that we can do is change how our own governance works, opening up ways for it to be more democratic. Maybe boards and commissions have more of a role than being advisory to the elected officials in our community. Maybe it's easier for us to put initiatives on the ballot that we, the people, develop and explore, and then are able to vote on. Maybe we need to have, and I saw this, I believe, within what you shared with me regarding the charter review process in your community. Maybe we need to have literally more representation. So more people on our city council, for instance, that are representing more people. The more people that sit on that city council, that's more, sharing of power as opposed to putting it in the hands of like 3 people or 5 people or 7 people. These are different ways that we can sort of push the boundaries of what we know today of democracy. And then the other piece to it, which we talked about with respect to places like Orange County, Florida, in which people put in stronger environmental protections for waterways than occurs at the state and federal level. How do we push that as well to strengthen the ability of us at the local level to make the kinds of changes that simply aren't happening at the state and federal level, whether it's regarding environmental protection, social justice protection, these things that empowering communities to make the kind of change they need in lieu of their state and federal government doing it, strengthening the ability of communities to put in place stronger protections for people, their community, and nature. That, I think, creates more democratic change and greater power for communities to make the kind of changes that they need to make in order to protect themselves. Particularly when things at the state and the federal level are so difficult to change, having communities be able to do it and then join hands across communities to be able to say, we need this not only within our own community, but we're going to share it with others and make the change together in solidarity at the state level.
What you were saying earlier about your 1 or 2 minutes of public comment, and in looking at that, I realized that a lot of legislative bodies, they all use the same parliamentary procedures. Either it's mostly Robert's Rules of Order. In San Jose, we use Rosenberg's, which is it's the same thing but a little more abbreviated. And when I looked back in history, that procedure, it dates back to like the French Revolution. And so it's like left over from that we kind of just copied and pasted, it seems like. And if the community's only ever allowed 2 minutes to make their piece, I feel like that is one of the things that we have to change. But I don't know if you have any thoughts on parliamentary procedures and how that impacts the actual discussion that's happening about our laws and legislations.
Well, I mean, right now we see that it's it's not fake. People can go up and speak, but unless hundreds of them are willing to go on a Monday night or Tuesday night, whatever, and do that over and over and over again, which of course many communities have done in order to make the change they need. It makes it really difficult. So why does it need to be that way? The fact that you look back at where the origins of it, I think, is amazing and fantastic. And we have to think about, why do they make it so restrictive? Because they're not interested and having it be otherwise. They're not interested in hearing from the very people who elected them into office, or they want to be very strict in how that happens. They don't have to take time with it. Well, maybe we need to change that. Maybe we need to change how, for instance, city council agendas are put together, or the kinds of ways that we as citizens, as people within a community, citizens or not, are able to engage. And so I think there are ways to explore that, to open that up so that it's not so tightly held, and that people have more ways to make more substantive changes within their communities.
Yeah. Thank you for that. I don't know if you had a chance to review the recommendations that are being put forth. We are hoping to do this every 10 years. So I wish we could do it again next year, except spend at least 2 years on it, because the commission only had 1 year to look at the charter recommendations. And we're expanding council districts. We're looking at ranked choice voting, and reforming some civic education around boards and commissions so that we can get other people to participate. Right now in San Jose, we have 40 to 60 vacancies year round on seats that people are not applying for, people don't know about. And just wondering if you saw anything in that list that you thought was noteworthy, or some inspiration and encouragement?
Well, I have to say, I thought the expansion of the council was important, number
Mhm.
one, to increase the representation. I think that's important. I also just to say that the board and commission reform, it's no wonder people aren't participating on them if they
Mhm.
don't feel that they can make meaningful change. That I think that's important to consider, and figure out if there's not only removing the citizenship requirements,
Mhm.
but so who can participate, but also what they're able to do. Um, and if that's going directly to the people so they can vote on something like the Charter Review Commission is doing, there's got to be ways to improve that, because otherwise, again, people can spend years on these boards and commissions to no satisfactory end.
Mhm.
I think that's important. So if you really want meaningful citizen or resident input, let's give that actual substance. Let's give that actual meaning. Let's not make that a 3-minute public comment period that basically we never hear from people again and it doesn't change anyone's opinion. Let's actually make it substantive so that these boards and commissions have the capacity, a pathway toward actual binding change. I think that would be very important.
Okay. That was definitely the one that I championed the most because I'm obsessed with boards and commissions. I've made music about it and made art about it, just trying to get people to understand because, yeah, I think it's pretty amazing that we have this space to come and talk policy with our legislative representatives and, city staff, but we're not really utilizing it to its full potential, and we're not really giving much respect to the residents and people who live here that volunteer like hours of their time, usually unpaid, to put forth these ideas and dreams and visions. And so our council meets in April, and so we're going to see, how this all works out. Okay. You have like 5 minutes. Can you talk about the moon really fast?
Oh yeah, we all love the moon. So we, just like we have industrial activity occurring all across the globe, bringing tremendous environmental impacts and destroying of ecosystems and accelerating species extinction and climate change. There's a great um, aim at industrial conquest of the moon. And we hear about like the Elon Musks and others of the world.
Hmm.
They want to essentially settle, colonize the moon.
Hmm.
And it's being treated as a dead object, like there's no life there. Without the moon, we're not going to survive here on Earth. It's responsible for a lot, keeping us in the orbit that we're in, for our tides and so on, reflecting light back to us. And yet there's all of these plans being made for industrializing the moon, and we don't have a clue how that's going to harm the moon. I got together with some folks who are involved with matters of space, matters of environmental protection here on Earth, and we developed the Declaration of the Rights of the Moon, and calling for recognition that the moon itself has rights to be protected, rights to be recognized as an ecosystem, one that we're not super familiar with, but the lunar environment is an environment that we humans have no right to interfere with, not to mention the fact that we're dependent upon it.
Hmm.
And it's really not, for us, it really is a conversation off Earth. That is to say, not just the moon, but beyond into other celestial bodies, Mars being one that often gets talked about in terms of, putting a human colony on that. And when we think about that word colony, we see what
Hmm.
colonization has done here on Earth. We've seen that industrial activities have done to the Earth. We have, done a good job of destroying our own life systems here on Earth. And we're calling for us not to export that to other celestial bodies, to
Hmm.
get ourselves into a place where we can live sustainably on our own home planet and not export all of the harm and damage and exploitation that we've done here elsewhere. So that really was the origins of this idea that before we truly colonize the moon or other, planets or other celestial bodies, we need to stop that before it happens, before the harm takes place, because we know what human beings are capable of. We know we don't put constraints on ourselves. And we know the harm that comes of that, and we want to stop it before it happens. I really appreciate you and helping to educate and expand sort of this dialogue with your fellow San Jose residents, because without that, no change will happen.
No change will happen. Okay. Well, thank you so much, for your time today. I really appreciate this conversation. I learned a lot, and it's just been such an honor to follow your work and then just to talk to you in real life. Well, kind of. I mean, in real life, but over Zoom.
Thank you so much for having us and for the work you're doing.